welcome, Happy New Year to those who've been before, and Happy New Year to those who haven't been before. Lovely to see you all. And what today is about, having a chat with Sue Turner, who is doing all sorts of exciting things. I'm really interested to find out, what Sue's been up to, what Sue's going to be doing. And yeah, I mean, for those who've been here before, the format very much is having a chat with Sue. Sue tells us a bit about herself, what she's up to. Anybody's got any questions, please, feel free to put them in during the course of the conversation. And yeah, we'll just see where it takes us. So, Sue, you are sitting in front of your lovely new background. But I first met you when you were working for Quartet. So take us on your journey.
Yeah, so I guess there's a common thread that runs through things that you'll detect as we go through, which is kind of wanting to do something to make the world a better place. And I think probably where that starts from is very young. When I grew up, I grew up in the northwest of England, and first came to Bristol in the mid 1980s. And just found this huge contrast between this place where I grew up, which was all sort of quite literally open cast coal mines surrounding the area that we lived, and textile mills where the windows had been put in, and because they'd all sort of gone out of use in the 1970s. And I came to Bristol, and it was like the streets were paved with gold. This beautiful architecture. And the first time I came was a January day, and the sun was shining. And I thought, wow, what is this place? And it just literally felt like another world. And it felt like people had completely different opportunities in this other world. And I got to come here as the first in my family ever to go to university. And it was to come to Bristol University and study law. And that whole thing about how I came to have that opportunity is a story we might go into later. But I really didn't feel I fitted in the world of lawyers. So I guess my journey is all about trying to find where I fit. Where is my place? Where do I belong? And I think maybe I finally found it, but we'll come on to that later. So my career has been 50% in very commercial, very dynamic businesses, and 50% in not-for-profits. And what I try to do is take the best of both worlds. So take the entrepreneurial spirit and the investments and ideas from the private sector and bring that into the third sector, the not-for-profit sector, with ideas about how purpose makes a difference and how really focusing on that whole concept of trying to make life fairer for more people. So cross-fertilizing between the two. So my background, I guess my major strengths are around government relations, communications and PR. I spent 10 years working for the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. So that was a very busy time learning that government relations craft. Spent time in headhunting, 5 years as a director of Bristol Port Company, which is the company that runs the docks outside Bristol. So very, very dynamic environment, very driven. And then, as you mentioned, 5 years as chief executive at Quartet Community Foundation, which was amazing. I met so many amazing people there, some of whom I can see on the call. Hello, Fiona. And just really getting to grips with philanthropy. How do you get people to be thinking about causes, things that might be dear to their hearts, but they perhaps don't think they can do anything about. And through philanthropy, we can all make a difference in people's lives, whether that's giving our time, our talent, or our treasure. And then, yes, coming bang up to date, I spent a year studying for a master's degree in artificial intelligence and data science, because I just felt there was more going on in the world than I could understand, and AI can understand a lot of things for us. And now I'm a non-executive director of a mutual organisation, so very purpose-driven. Got the master's degree through which I set up my own consultancy, looking at how I can help companies to really get to grips with understanding AI, putting it to good use, not just for themselves, but for society as well. And I've also taken on the role chairing an organisation called the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, which may appeal to some of the medics on the session today as well. So that's it in a nutshell.
Wow, I mean that's quite a big nutshell. Let's be honest. It's interesting because like you, I came from Anglesey, so definitely more north, and like you came to Bristol to do law in the university, and I can absolutely understand that sort of like that just massive shift. And my family are all from the South Wales Valley, so yeah, Bristol's a really interesting space, isn't it? And it has got that history of philanthropy. And I think, for those who know Bristol, and the law school, it's the Wills building, and it is all built off the back of philanthropy. And, you know, I think that that was always something that I felt when I was there, that there is this strong sense of philanthropy in Bristol. And so initially, you know, I am still interested in that sort of, I don't know, that's not where you are now, but that sort of background is, have you seen a change in sort of people's views on philanthropy during post during pandemic, and you know, and how do you get people involved? How do you get people to actually think like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think philanthropy has just changed massively over, well, several decades. So if I go back to my strange childhood, so I grew up, my mum's a single mum, and she was bringing up three of us. I'm the youngest of the three, you know, pretty much on her own. And the school, the senior school that my brother and sister went to was, you can only call it a sink school. Really, really not a good school, not a place to go. I mean, rather than the teachers sort of berating you if you didn't bring your homework, quite literally the other kids would beat you up if you did bring your homework. So this was a tough place to be. And I was destined, of course, to follow my brother and sister and go to the same school. But at the age of 11, I took the entrance exam for a really good school called Bolton School, a fee-paying school focused entirely on good educational results for girls. And I got in. But of course, we didn't have the money to pay for me to go there. My mum's a nurse, so, you know, this isn't going to happen. But there was a scheme set up to give girls like me the opportunity to go to that school. And so because of that, I had this amazing education, completely different from my brother and sister. And because of that, I got to be the first in my family ever to go to university, and everything else that's happened since. So that's kind of more the old-fashioned version of philanthropy, you know, that we sort of, a group of wealthy individuals do something because they think it's the right thing to do, and a fairly limited number of people benefit from that. Through my master's degree, I got in touch with some people at Oxford University who run a program called Effective Altruism. And there's a book by a guy called William McCaskill, if anybody's interested in reading it, called Doing Good Better. And that book really is the foundations of this effective altruism movement. It's basically saying, rather than just chucking money at the first charity that you see, the one that has the biggest adverts on TV, the one that just your neighbour knows about and has told you about, really think about your philanthropy and think about how you can do the best that you can. So one of the things that William McCaskill argues is that rather than doing what I did, going and running a charity for 5 years, you perhaps might go off and be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, and then pledge to give, say, 10% of your earnings through your lifetime to charity. And that way you may actually do far more good than actually becoming the doctor volunteering with Médecins Sans Frontières or whatever else you might do. And it's really quite challenging because it does make us think more deeply about philanthropy. And one of the things that we realized at the Community Foundation was that there were lots of people who would do their philanthropy pretty much towards the end of their lives. So, I'll put something in my will and I've decided I don't need that relatively small amount of money and I'll give some away. But actually, some of the more thoughtful approaches to philanthropy were saying, I could do it whilst I'm alive. You know, the whole giving while living thing. It's really exciting to see the good you're doing as you go along. And so two people really stick in my mind from my days at the Community Foundation, Helen and Peter Wild. And some medics on the call may know Peter Wild, and some may know Helen because of all sorts of work in the community that she did before they moved up to Scotland. And Helen and Peter were really good examples of that giving while living, because as they approached, Peter approached retirement as a senior medic at the BRI, he and Helen worked out how much money they needed for their retired lives, and then also that they had a chunk of money that they didn't need, and their children didn't need it to be passed on to them. So they said, right, we're going to give away this money during our lifetimes. And they had such fun getting to know the organisations that they cared about and helping people and seeing the difference that it made. And Helen actually became chair of trustees at Quartet Community Foundation. And this was a really inspirational chair because she was living it, not just talking about other people doing it, but doing it herself. So the trends, I think, are that people are doing more giving while living, if you've got larger amounts to give. But the one thing, of course, we all saw during COVID was people saying, how can I help in my local community? So that volunteering spirit. And when I was doing my degree, I figured I had some time on Thursday afternoons. I didn't need to be studying quite so hard. And so I would go off and volunteer at the local jab vaccine clinic, and not putting the jabs in people's arms, I'm not that brave, but just waving the traffic around and logging people in on the computer and all those sorts of things. And I think so many of us have got those stories of things that we did during the COVID times that we're carrying on doing now. And I hope that's a really positive thing that's come from it, that it may not be giving away £1 million. We haven't got £1 million to give, but we're doing what we can with our time and our talent. And that, I think, is something that will continue.
That is yes, I think that sort of giving and living is a really nice way of looking at it. And you mentioned your 10%, and that's sort of a very sort of traditional sort of tithe sort of mentality, isn't it? But it doesn't need to be so big. It can be tiny amounts, but actually cumulatively over the years, it can really make a huge difference, can't it, to people?
Yeah.
So I think Kit's put a question in, which I think is very interesting. Any changes in Bristol philanthropy pre and post Colston? Contentious, because we all know that Mr. Colston, himself, there are the almshouses, is everything that's named after him, but obviously it's now quite a tainted word, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, from your experience, anything that you've seen there?
I definitely have noticed people who give quietly, and they don't want to be in the public eye, not because they think they've got as bad a reputation as Colston now has, but because they just worry that they're not perfect. They're not perfect human beings. They haven't got perfect track records of always doing exactly the right thing. And they think if they put themselves in the public eye by signing a large check and putting their name on the side of a building, then they're going to be open to being abused. And that's really a shame, because I think we want to encourage people to claim what they're doing. And of course, the charities then have the burden put on them, because they need to do their due diligence. And if some money has come from a source that may not be particularly reputable or savoury, what do? Their constitution may not allow them to turn the money down. That's the ironic thing, that the charity, we've had some examples like this in recent years, of charities getting tremendous flack for turning money down from donors, but they don't always have the power to refuse that money. So it's a complicated area, and I think trustees of charities in particular have got to be really alert to thinking about where money comes from, and do they want it, and if not, can they change their constitution so that they're allowed to turn it down.
And that sort of tainted notion of tainted money, but actually it's money that will do good. Yeah. That is a hard place to be, isn't it? When the third sector does so much. I mean, whatever your sort of particular choice of charity, there are so much need for this support, and charities are doing their level best in very difficult circumstances, and to feel that they can't accept funds has to be hard going, isn't it? So.
Yeah, and it's one of the challenges when you run a community foundation, because for people that perhaps don't know the concept of community foundations, it goes back to America, as so many things in charity do. We tend to copy their philanthropic models and adapt it for our own use. But the first community foundation in the world was set up in 1914 in Cleveland, Ohio. It was actually set up by a lawyer, now who's a lawyer and a banker, called Frederick H. Goff. And he recognized that it was crazy for people to be putting money in their wills or in their lifetimes into charitable trusts for really narrowly constrained purposes. And the famous example he gave was the charitable trust set up for the education of the children of chimney sweeps. Lovely idea in 18 something or other, but time moves on, and there aren't so many children of chimney sweeps need to be educated, but the money legally is confined to this purpose and can't be used for anything else. So he said, this is crazy. We don't know what the needs of the future are going to be, but we know there will be needs. So why don't we have a common pot, let's call it a community foundation, that people can put their charitable donations into, and then we'll rely on the people who come after us way in the future to know what the needs of the day are, and apply the money accordingly. So that's how the first community foundation was set up in Cleveland, Ohio in 1914. And their endowment, their permanent pot of money, is now worth over $2 billion. And they've spent over $1 billion in their local community over the 100+ years. So wow, it really works.
Which is phenomenal, isn't it?
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
The change, and I think to probably misquote Bill Gates, nothing changes in 1 year, everything changes in 10. And you think, as you say, chimney sweeps, just not really, you're not going to send small children up chimney sweeps, thankfully, thanks to Lord Shaftesbury, and all that. And, these things do move on. So I think, I really like the idea of Quartet. I know sort of when I'm talking to clients that, they go, oh, that's great. I've got a way of, of being that, doing that philanthropy, doing that good without feeling constrained. And because charities have had a bit of a rough time, haven't they, with a sort of, how the money's used and, how, their tactics.
Yeah.
And, sort of having been a trustee of a charity myself, it was one of the big things we were talking about, how do we make sure that, we are seen to be doing the right thing? And it's hard going.
which is the major inspiration for me in so many ways to do the master's degree, because we as Quartet Community Foundation, we were giving out, by the time I finished there, £5 million a year in grants. So you're giving money out, but not just doing it aimlessly, you're getting all sorts of information back in on what's happening in society, what's happening in community groups, what good the grant did, what's changing. And so we had vast amounts of data in our database, so in our systems, computer systems, and it was just a constant torment to me that we couldn't really use it, we couldn't analyze it. Why? Because it's words. Lots of it, sometimes numbers would come back in, some data, but lots of it was words. So we had an amazing volunteer, a woman called Isabel Michaels rather, who would analyze this data for us and try and find meaning in amongst all these words. And I kept saying, we must have a better way of doing it. There must be a way that computers can do it, which is when I heard about a branch of artificial intelligence called natural language processing. What it does is look at large amounts of text and tries to figure out what the themes are and the threads are and how things group together so that you can then analyze it. Of course, lawyers use it, I think, quite significantly when analysing vast amounts of documents, and it's replacing some of the jobs that the very junior lawyers used to do. But for us as a charity, I spoke to people at Bristol University and said, can you make this work for us? Can you set up something that will do this for us? It just seemed to be impossible. And I thought, this isn't right. So I thought, well, I'll go off and I'll find out for myself, how could this be done? And then see what I can do to fill the gap later on. So I haven't filled the gap yet. It's on my to-do list. But there's certainly the technology is there to do it. But the complicated things with so much stuff to do with data and AI is how you organize the data. And one thing I learned through my year of doing the master's degree is that you spend 80% of your time wrangling data. So finding out what's missing, trying to impute values for things that aren't there, realizing that things are in the wrong format, changing things around, and amazingly frustrating. You want to get on with the task, but you can't until the data's in the right format. So yeah, trying to extract information which you as a charity can then use to prove the value of what you're doing, to prove your impact, is a whole world which I can't wait to get to grips with, but I'm not there yet.
So was this a taught masters, or did you have to do a dissertation? What was the format?
It was a taught masters, and it's a part of a government programme which was recently set up. So I was the first cohort to go on this programme, where it's about bringing people who normally you wouldn't expect to be in the world of science and data and AI at all. So it's trying to diversify it, because we have a massive deficit of the amount of people that we need in that sector. But we don't just want one type of person in the sector. We want diversity of thought, diversity of life experience, backgrounds, etc. So the group of us on the course were really interesting, and lots of women, lots of people from different backgrounds, lots of different ages. Wasn't quite the oldest there, but nearly. And we had a dissertation at the end of it. And for my project, I worked with my old friends from the Bristol Port Company. And I got an agreement with them that I was allowed to use several years worth of their safety data. So when any little incident happens, or big incident, whatever, hopefully they're mostly little, they have to record it, of course. And then they have to try and find lessons to learn from it so that that can't happen again. So my project was to see if artificial intelligence, specifically a branch called machine learning, could be used to analyse that data to find common threads, which the management could then use to make the place safer. And we found it worked. Not massively successful, because the set of data wasn't as big as we might want it to be, but it worked. You could draw some inferences to make things safer. So what we're now doing is seeing if we can work with my university, which was Hull University, and a much bigger group of ports across the country to get more data and then build this model so that it's even more robust.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, Gareth, there we are. Gareth's got a question, and we've got quite a lot of questions. So it seems like we'll go with Gareth. Do you want to?
Actually, mine's a bit of a nerdy question. I spent sort of a long time working in expert systems and AI in the 80s and 90s. I suppose what you'd vaguely call AI. And I just wondered whether your dissertation was published somewhere.
Well, that's an interesting one, Gareth. I ought to publish it because you know, it's there, and you know, it's something I ought to be proud of, but I haven't because I'm a bit nervous. Now I should take the lead from my son because he's partway through his maths degree at the moment, and he did a summer intern placement last year, and he published his summer intern placement, and so he's leading the way, and I'm thinking, if he can do that, I should do it as well. So I must get on with it, Gareth. You're giving me a kick up the behind. I will do it.
or otherwise, if you wouldn't mind sending a copy to me, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, no, I'd love to, yeah, and I'd be interested to get your comments because, as you say, artificial intelligence, most people think it's this sort of new shiny thing, but actually it's been around for, well, since the 1950s, so it's got a long pedigree. And the difference now, of course, is we're gathering so much more data, particularly through all our mobile phones and all these devices that we have on all the time through the internet. And we have processing power now, the ability to process so much more data very, very quickly at relatively low cost, monetary cost, though we come back to environmental cost perhaps. So that is why we're getting this big push now for people using it, and it's out there in all sorts of ways. And then one of the main things I'm doing at the moment with my consultancy is talking to people about the possibilities and the pitfalls of AI. And that's really interesting. I mean, basically, we've got on them typically on boards of companies, you know, a third, if that, understand technology. So these are people who are supposed to be making multi-million-pound decisions about how to spend money on this technology, but they don't know how to evaluate it because they don't understand it. So I'm trying to help boards learn what it's about. Sorry, Gareth.
And I think you're entirely right, man. I'm in a kind of a chat group with a group of sort of old colleagues who used to work on the Alvey project and various things a long time ago. And the thing that's in agreement is, first of all, that the surveys around people's understanding of AI are fairly worthless because they ask people whether they understand them. They don't test whether they understand them. And the second thing is that, being generous, probably about 80% of references to AI are just marketing terms and nothing actually to do genuinely with any application of pattern matching or machine learning or anything of that sort.
Yeah, you're right. But you have to have a reasonable degree of technical confidence and competence to detect the difference between the hype and the reality. And there's a Capgemini survey last year which said that 90% of businesses who had some sort of experience of AI found it had damaged them in some way. 85% of machine learning and data science projects fail. What? Yeah, this is horrendous. So there's estimated that there's going to be $200 billion, so globally, dollars figure, spent on AI services by 2025. 2025 is just around the corner. So we're going to be spending vast amounts of money on this stuff. And the people who are governing organizations, running organizations, making these decisions will be tripping themselves up because they don't know how it works. So there's some wonderful examples of AI working really well, but shall I give you just one example of where it's really messed up? And it just shows you the governors think, okay, Kit's nodding, I feel I've got thank you. Well, there's a company, American business called Zillow, and what they do is fairly straightforward. Online, they're matching people who want to buy, sell, or rent homes. So pretty straightforward. But Zillow got kind of overconfident with their technological prowess, and they built, as an experiment, as an artificial intelligence and machine learning model, which could predict the price that the house would sell at. So they thought, this gives us a business opportunity. We, rather than letting a purchaser buy the property off a seller, we can get in the middle of that. We'll buy the property off the seller, hold it onto it ourselves, and then sell it on for the higher price that we're predicting it will go for at a later date. And they thought, fantastic. They tried it in a small way, and it worked in a small way. But when they scaled it, it didn't work. When market conditions changed, they hadn't got enough data in the system to be able to work with the changed systems. So Zillow, over the course of a few months, made a $300 million loss, and their share price tanked. They lost $9 billion off their share price. So that's a really good example of AI going wrong.
Yeah, goodness me. Yes, Kit.
Thanks. Just following on from that, I wonder whether you were familiar with Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, which has got excellent examples of how our cognitive biases are so often so unconsciously coded into the AI algorithms, and then we get the answers not that we should get, but that our subconscious makes us get, with all the racism, sexism, and so forth that is there under the surface.
Yeah, so there's some wonderful examples of how, so it applies to any sort of organization, how human resources can use AI. And some lovely examples about using it, for example, to select people who might be the best new recruits. So who are we going to interview? We've got 1,000 CVs. The AI can look at those very quickly and whittle it down to the 20 that actually get interviewed. But exactly as you're saying, Kit, if the AI is working off who your existing best employees are, and that's maybe not a very diverse pool of people, then it's going to give you copycat for the next generation of employees, which is not what you want. So Google themselves have had this problem and figured out what was going wrong and why it was suggesting to them people that were not as diverse as they wanted their future employees to be. So there are definitely pitfalls. The other side of it is the ethical side, and I really enjoy getting into the whole subject of AI ethics and governance. So for example, as a company that has about 20,000 employees, so pretty large, and they recognised that doing an annual staff survey was a pretty ineffective way to understand what their teams really think and feel about the organisation. But it's what most of us do. The annual staff survey goes out, you just get a snapshot on one day of the people who happen to return the form, and you don't really understand more than that. So this company said, actually, we could use machine learning, so this natural language processing I was talking about earlier on, to look at the words people are using and how they're responding on our various internal communications channel. So they have a Slack channel, they've got various other communications, so they could, if they put out a company announcement, see how people respond. Does one person forward it on to 50 people with positive comments? Is somebody else forwarding on to 10 people with negative comments? How can they analyze that to understand perhaps who the future leaders of the business might be? And of course, that all sounds great. So you understand the sentiment in the company. You can do it every day. So you're tracking in real time rather than just doing it once a year. But what happens if they use that same information when they're deciding who to promote or who to make redundant? And as a lawyer, Heledd, you're probably immediately going, whoa,
I know, making me nervous.
Yeah, exactly. So because they haven't got an ethics committee, they haven't thought about the ethics of how they're using data and AI, they could easily trip themselves up. Now they're aware of this, so they're backfilling it. One of the things I spend a lot of time with companies talking about is how you can actually get on and do the work of thinking about your ethics right now. And it sounds horrendous to most company leaders, chief execs, I'm talking to them, they just say, oh, crikey, do we have to do that? Oh, I don't want to. But when you say, well, have you been doing corporate social responsibility work for donkey's years? Oh, yeah, of course we have. Have you been doing environment, social and governance work in more recent years and thinking about your impact on climate change? Well, yeah, of course we've been doing that. Okay, so we put all that together with some wider parameters of thinking about what you will and won't do in the future, and you're there. So it's not starting from a blank sheet of paper. And of course, if you're working with purpose-driven organizations, which are my favorite ones, I am biased towards them, I admit, then they have much more of that sense of their values and purpose and what they will and won't do. But yeah, thinking about ethics and pulling that together is really fascinating.
And you just made a really interesting point. I think, we're sort of 2 years, almost 2 years of COVID, coronavirus pandemic. And we, saying at the beginning, always back to normal. Thank you, Boris Johnson. I think, well, no, but our team, my team, my colleagues are like, no, well, we're not going back to that. So from a very traditional sort of, city centre office, all the lawyers come in, all the staff come in, we have dispersed, and we, like most other companies, have just embraced all this technology, and it's accelerated everything for us so much. But as you say, I think it's the behind that. What is underpinning this technology? What's the use? What's the oversight? What are the ethics? And for me, I think what you're just saying about data, utterly fascinating. Because should we be looking at what people are doing, and how much time they're spending on chatting on Teams when they should be working, and that data. I mean, it's huge amounts of data to scrape.
Yeah,
isn't there?
Absolutely. And it's that old thing which we always say, just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Yeah.
But that's where your ethics has to come in and has to be fully formed in an organization to make that distinction between what we could do and what we should do. Mm-hmm. And it's something, again, coming from that charity world, you talk about a lot. That you might be some organization that you could give a grant to, for example, but what are they really doing? What impact are they having? And then making fine decisions all the time between doing things because they seem nice to do or because they are the ones that really ought to be done.
Well, I think there's lots of support for publishing your dissertation in the chat, so you'd be delighted to know. I think everybody be utterly fascinated, because it's one of those things that, of course, now you've said it, makes complete sense. But just hadn't really thought about it. And yes, you mentioned that the sort of law firms and AI is taking on, and yes, just reading vast amounts of text and just picking things out is a huge change, a huge sea change from having junior lawyers sit there with a pen and a paper and reading it and going, if you can chuck it into a photocopier, chuck it into your computer, and you get the data out and it is accurate. And I think that's always the fear, isn't it? But then you've got the same problem with a person. They might overlook something, but the speed with which that change can happen is incredible.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're seeing in health and care. So with my other hats on as chair of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, so we see there the huge opportunities for AI to do things as accurately as humans. So lots of it around diagnostics. So that might be analysing X-rays, it might be analysing microscope slides. But now there's AI models that are as good as a mid-range practitioner at detecting disease, and there are some that are even as good as the top consultants. And I think a lot of this is about not saying let's replace humans always, but saying can we augment it so that the machine does the grunt work of churning through the basics, and then the humans are there to do the extra, the more finesse things, the things that are so very intangible. And then of course in care to do the things that are really, well, I think will always be for humans to do, where it's about having that personal touch and having alignment with people and empathy and understanding in a way that I don't think any of us really expect computers will do.
Gareth.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of expand it a little bit, if I might do, because I find this fascinating. One thing that I am kind of interested and concerned about is any kind of advance, anything new, if you like, carries some level of risk. How do you, first of all, quantify the risk in using kind of AI? And how do you then set an acceptable level of risk once you have quantified it?
Yeah, okay. So the whole area of risk and AI is emerging. And I'm really lucky that I'm working with a group of people across the world to think about what an audit of an AI system might look like. And there's no mandate at the moment. There's nobody saying that you have to audit AI systems, but I think it'll come and probably a lot more quickly than financial audits. So what we're doing is working from the principles of how financial audits work, which you're all really familiar with. We know how that works, and there's very common standards, so slight jurisdictional differences, but common standards across the globe for financial audits. So we take those principles and then think about AI audits. And what we're trying to do is build a framework that looks at the ethics, bias, cybersecurity, trust, so that we can, or privacy as well, so that we can put together a whole framework that companies can then compare their own practices to and see where they fit. And I don't think it'll be that far in the future that regulators around the world will say, fine, companies are going to use AI systems, algorithms, autonomous systems, but they need to show that they've touched on all those 5 pillars and they've got proof that they are attempting to comply. And one of the things, to answer your question, Gareth, we talk about a lot is risk, and the fact that there will always be residual risk. You're not going to be able to get it out of the system at all. So you might look at bias, and you might be able to evidence that you've thought about bias in the data that you have, and you might be able to evidence that you've thought about bias that could happen once the model that you're using is actually out in the wild and being used. Could it be poisoned, for example, by some malicious person injecting new data into it to poison it? And I don't know if you guys have come across it, but there was a Microsoft example from a couple of years back where they produced a chatbot called Tay, and it was supposed to be a teenage female. I will respond like a teenage female, and they put it on Twitter and they said to the world, educate Tay, here is Tay. And Tay was this sort of blank sheet of paper. Within 24 hours, they had to take Tay offline because she'd become a racist, Hitler-loving troll, basically. And so you can poison things, even if the model is set up beautifully, it can be poisoned as you go along. So we need to have standards that we want people to operate to, but we also need to accept that those standards won't get rid of the risk altogether. But if companies are aware that they could be encountering more risk as they go along, and they've got systems in place to watch for that, to monitor for it, and to correct it when it happens, that's probably about the best that we're going to get to. Just on the regulatory point, I think it's really interesting when you look at different jurisdictions around the world, how they're treating this. The Americans are very hands-off. As we've seen with social media, let it happen, see what happens, not trying to regulate. The Brits, they're trying to tread a bit more of a careful line and give best practice guidance on standards. The EU is actually leading the world in thinking about regulating AI, which is in going through the mode of drafting, looking out the situation that can happen with Internet of Things. So you've got, you might have your Alexa device listening at home and Siri on your phone and so on. And the Europeans have been the first one to pinpoint that these devices are probably anti-competitive because they restrict so much what you can do with them. So then you may think it's giving me all this choice in the world, but it's not. It's directing you, if it's Alexa, for example, it's directing you to Amazon products and services. It's tied into them. So it's not giving you a free reign of the world. And of course, you can't just plug another device in. You've only got that one that you can work with. It's not interoperable with other things. So yeah, lots of things that we are looking at, which will come out as we look more at ethics over the years to come.
I think, as individuals, we're all voluntarily giving out so much information day in, day out, aren't we? Whether it's social media, whether it's just filling in forms online to get a discount code, and you think, my goodness, so as go back to being a lawyer, when I was training, I was always told, never write anything down you wouldn't want on the front page of the Daily Mail.
Good advice.
Good advice. And it's that sort of sit, and if you're going to do something, write a letter, print it, put it in the drawer, go home, come back and think about it and do that. So there's always this time, there's this breathing space we were always told to put into things. Technology just doesn't give you that anymore.
No.
And I think voluntarily, I'm equally as guilty of this. I sign up to all sorts of things. I think, gosh, there's no way I would probably do this if it wasn't so easy online.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the deep psychology. It's one of the things that really puzzles me about Facebook, for example, and the big tech companies. They are built on a really deep understanding of psychology, how to press our buttons, how to make us want to do the things that they want us to do because they make money out of it. Incredibly clever. And I know I come from a background of trying to do some good in the world, but I just think, why don't they apply a tiny fraction of that incredible knowledge of psychology to say, oh, can we do some more good in the world? How can we do more with this technology? How can we do more with our products and all the contacts and connections we have and our data to actually do good in the world? And I know they're set up to make money from shareholders, but it just frustrates me. And talking the other day about the children's code in this country, this was talking with this group of international audit specialists, and we were saying how the children's code, it's the first time in the world that something other than shareholder interests gets a look in and gets parity. So children's interests will have the same parity under the children's code as the commercial shareholder interests. And that's quite outstanding, really, when you think that we are pushing businesses to pay attention to something as much as they pay attention to their own shareholder interests. It would be lovely, I think, if it was more in case of children's interests, but well, parity will do for now.
Parity is definitely a good start, isn't it? Yeah. It is. I'm utterly fascinated, with the speed at which things we're changing, the world's moving, and all that you're saying. You go, this is just we're in the infancy of this, aren't we? And it's the technology is going to sort of develop, and then, as you say, you're going to have to backfill all that sort of ethics and governance and coding and understanding, and and we're sort of, I suppose, we're in a bit of that people always complain about lawyers, and the law is incredibly slow to catch up with sort of morality. And you go, well, yes, because we can't just go rushing in and doing these things. And I really sort of, what I'm sort of hearing and then seeing is that this is what's happening. The technology is going at such a pace, that even if you back to your chimney sweep, so if you do put in some governance for something that takes 18 months to put together, they may have just completely gone ahead and moved on so fast. So the nature of the beast is that it changes, but we need to be really thinking about this, don't we? Much broader.
Yeah, and I think that's why ethics can't just be a sort of once and done thing that sits with one person on the board. Oh, that's our ethics champion, so now we've done ethics. It's got to be something that really permeates throughout the whole business, so that somebody who's developing an AI tool in some part of the business, or more likely actually somebody that's making a contract to have a service delivered by someone outside the company, has got that knowledge to make the decision, or at least to recognize the problem and the risks of what might happen, what might go wrong, and then refer it internally. And we talk a lot about setting up ethics committees. And I'm not a great one for having too many committees, but I do see the value in this case, because it's all about coming from so many different perspectives, isn't it? And no one individual is going to understand all the different life experiences and all the different ways to include people. So if you have an ethics committee, at least have a chance then of saying, well, we've got representatives from our stakeholders, the wider community, our customers, internally, different people in the business, and we can then be running things past people to say, should we do it like this? Should we do it like that? What are the pitfalls that you see? And there's a lovely session I went to the other week, which was about designing AI with inclusivity in mind. And the presenters on it were all people who came from different abilities and disabilities, different philosophies and different backgrounds. It was really stimulating to listen to people. And the key thing that came out of it was, typically when we design technology and technological solutions, we design for the 60% in the middle where we reckon we're going to get the money from. And actually, if we're going to do inclusive design, it has to be starting from designing for 100%. So let's design systems that work for everybody. Then they're going to be brilliant for the 60% in the middle, but they're also going to be brilliant for the 20% either side of that.
But actually, I mean, honestly, utterly fascinating. I think Fiona's been popping some really interesting links into the chat box. And absolutely. I think Fiona did ask a question. Go back up. Bear with. There we go. Fiona's asking, did you catch the Wreath lectures on AI this year? And if you did, what did you take away?
Yeah, I listened to them. Mostly I was listening on catch up because Wednesday mornings always seem to be a bit busy for me. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting. So Stuart Russell has written a number of books, which I've got on my bookshelf, and he is one of the leading thinkers in this whole area, and really stimulating. I thought the way he conveyed messages about AI was very clever and straightforward and appealing to people. He did touch on some of the bias things. I think the trap that I've so far today not fallen into, but that's easy to fall into, is that people get obsessed by autonomous weapons and self-driving cars, and how would they make a decision if they're either going to kill 3 people here or 2 people there, which route would they take? And these sort of things of AI and becoming killer robots, or taking over the world because it gets more clever than humans and we can't control it anymore. So these are all really exciting existential risk ideas, and they do need to be talked about, but they are being talked about hugely. My frustration is that with Stuart's lectures and also with the sorts of work that I come across, not enough people are talking about the everyday risks, the sorts of things I've been talking about with Zillow, the property company, and the HR tools. So I guess I'm a kind of deeply pragmatic person. Perhaps the background that I come from is not a sort of highfalutin philosophical background. So I like to try and put more of that spotlight on the everyday risks of AI now. I know that people like Stuart and the cover folk are out there thinking those big thoughts for the future. So yeah, I enjoyed it, Fiona, and I think if anybody hasn't caught up with it, do follow that link in the chat and have a listen. They're really accessible and interesting.
Which is absolutely, yeah, utterly fascinating. So I do want to move on to your other hat of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics.
Yeah, Gareth's got his hand up. Should we take that?
Yes, sorry, Gareth.
Yeah, I actually wanted to take issue with you, Sue, and your bit about the 60% finding something that's designed for everybody to be really great. I spent a lot of time, all my time over the last 30 odd years, writing systems for advice giving. And what's very clear from that is that the kind of tool that an expert uses would be unusable by somebody who doesn't have that kind of level of knowledge and experience. And the kind of tool that you write for somebody that is a first-time user or something would be unbearably painful and slow to somebody who was an expert. So how do you think AI kind of squares that, if you like?
Yeah, I guess the sort of things we were talking about when we were talking about accessibility was that there's so much that thinking going on in about AI tools where they are only being designed for the experts to use, and they don't have to be. I turn the other way around. The assumption is that they're designing for the expert user, but what we're trying to do is push people to think more about the non-expert user and think if they can design for them as well. So I don't know if that answers the question. I recognise what you're saying, that sometimes things would be best designed for people of a certain knowledge or expertise, and you wouldn't be designing them for the first time user. But I think there's so much about just the simple way things are designed that don't make them accessible. And the words, words matter hugely. And one example that I use a lot now is if I'm doing a job advert. So the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, we're just about to go out and recruit for a chief executive. And as we're looking at that process, we are running the advert and the candidate pack that we put together through a gender decoder. And that's a little AI tool where we put the words in and it tells us, is this coded more masculine, more feminine, or is it neutral in the middle? And of course, we want to aim to be neutral in the middle. And so that's a pretty simple example of something that is easy to use. But another example would be perhaps doing meetings like this. I didn't do it at the beginning of this session, but I've come across a number of people who make it their habit when they start doing a session like this to describe themselves. So they're assuming that there might be some people on the call for whom seeing and taking in information visually isn't their strength. And therefore, if they describe what they look like, that person doesn't have the burden of trying to see the screen. And things like that just stop me short and make me think that we all have privileges of one sort or another, and it's about getting beyond those and thinking about how life is for the people who aren't as advantaged, who haven't got the same training and skills that we have. And sometimes we can then take those leaps and say, okay, I will make this in a way that those people can access just as easily as I can. Does Gareth want to come back on that? I'm sure I haven't answered the question.
No, that's fine. I think the recognition that one size doesn't fit all still has to remain there. That's all.
Yeah, but that we should still push ourselves to try and be better, to include more and more people.
Absolutely, and I take a lot of those points that you've made.
Yeah, great. So Faculty of Clinical Informatics, it's a very new organisation. It's only set up and established as a charity in 2019. And it's all about trying to unlock the potential of people working in the digital sphere in health and social care. So there are estimated by the NHS to be about 14,000 more people needed in the NHS and care with clinical informatics skills between now and 2030. So 14,000 people to find from somewhere. And what is a clinical informatician? Well, it's basically somebody working in any job in the health and care sector where they're using data to try and get better outcomes for people. So I've come across loads of people since I took over as chair in September from different backgrounds, and some of them are consultants and doctors and GPs. Some of them are physiotherapists and carers and nurses, and all sorts of different backgrounds. And the common factor that almost every single one has is that they started off in one direction, in a medical or caring profession, clinical profession, and then somebody said to them, oh, there's some numbers here, can you analyse them? Or they recognised there seems to be a pattern here, I wonder what's going on. So they started analysing data, and then lo and behold, a couple of years later, they got this label that they're a clinical informatician. And they thought, what does it mean? How do I develop my career? So there's now roles being created, particularly in the NHS, of chief clinical information officers. And nobody's really defined what the role is. So we have, as the faculty, we've defined what that role is. And for people across the care and clinical sectors, we're saying we can help you develop your skills, give you support, give you mentorship, give you peers that you can talk to, and help you develop in these roles. So we're encouraging people that are already in the health and care sector to develop their skills. And then the next part of what we need to do will be about encouraging people not in the sector at the moment to apply their skills coming into the sector. So we're a charity, and we're funded mostly at the moment by money coming through from the NHS and also the subscription fees from our members. But there's a huge job for us to do, hence why I want to get this new chief executive in post and put the burden on their shoulders of taking things forward really fast, because 2030 is only just around the corner.
It very much so. Kit?
I'm fascinated by what you just said about the clinical informatics. And when you said looking to take people in from outside, do you mean non-clinicians, or do you mean non-primary or secondary care workers?
Yeah, so it could be, it's got to be people. This is one of the discussions that we spend a lot of time on. How much medical, clinical knowledge are people going to need to have in order to be a clinical informatician? So are we going to be working with people who've got very little experience on that side? What what will they need to learn? Are we working mainly with people who have got some allied skills that we can bring in and use to develop their skills? So I don't have the answer to that at the moment, but it's absolutely on the money.
If I can just follow that, I've been mentoring a mathematician, a PhD mathematician, who is trying to work out whether she should be doing a master's in modelling or in AI. Which would you recommend?
Ooh, it's a bit like when I'm talking to my son. So he's in year 3 of his degree, a maths degree at the moment, and he'll stay on and do the 4th year, I'm sure. But after that, he's wrestling with what he does. He's taking some machine learning courses this year. He's learnt to program in Python over the summer. So he's got himself the tools to go in lots of different roles. So I'd say the same for the student that you're mentoring. Get lots of tools and test things out and see where your heart lies. I mean, modeling, it's part of AI. AI obviously is the bigger framework that machine learning models and other models fit into. So I'd say if she's got good coding skills and enjoys coding more, then the modeling may take her in that direction. But if she actually wants to combine a number of different areas, not least the ethics and all that, the governance side, then looking at wider AI might be more appropriate. But there are a lot of courses to choose from now. So when I was looking, so that was about March, April 2020, for somebody without maths and science skills, there were quite a small set of master's degrees to choose from. But for somebody with good maths skills, and now things have moved on to 2022, yeah, she'll have a lot of choice. So I think it will probably be that combination of how much time she wants to spend coding versus thinking about other elements of AI.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that you say you come from a non-STEM background, but actually this covers so much, doesn't it? This covers STEM, non-STEM, people, behavior, psychology, all of these things that are hugely relevant, regardless of your sort of academic slant that we might be coming to this with. And I think it's utterly fascinating, and just how huge a world is being opened up.
Yes, and I think that's exactly right, and that's why it's so important to get people with all sorts of different backgrounds and life experiences into the sector, so we're not just getting one little narrow focus on what it should all be about and how it should be governed, because we need all the different perspectives to make this work for everybody.
Absolutely. Sue, it's been absolutely wonderful listening to you. Has anybody got anything else they want to ask Sue before we go? Oh, Fiona, there is a view that all you need to be a mathematician is A, to ask questions, and B, spot patterns. Well, yes. I think people get frightened about maths, though, don't they? I think there's this sort of like, it's numbers, I can't do that because I was never very good at geometry. And I think, well, there's so much more to it than that. Yeah. So my husband's an engineer, and he says, it's a language. It's a language like any other. And as long as you can, learn to speak that language, then don't get hung up on whether you can do times tables in your head.
Yeah, that's it, and giving people confidence to play with it, and as you say, not be afraid of making mistakes. So just look at the data, see what it tells you, then keep questioning, as Fiona's saying there, keep questioning, asking questions. And same for philanthropy as well, isn't it? You may think there's one way of doing it, but keep asking questions, keep saying why, and seeing what answers come back to you.
Kit, do you feel more of a STEM person or a lawyer? Oh,
I was never a lawyer. I was never a lawyer. Just, yeah,
swerved at the last minute. Very sensible.
Yeah. But no, I don't think I'm a STEM person either. I guess what am I? I have no idea. A practical philosopher? I don't know. Is that a thing?
I think so. I think, why not?
Yeah, still, I guess I'm still just working on trying to do some good out there and trying to give more people a fair chance of a good life. So if I'm doing something in that direction and I can apply things and get other people inspired to do more good stuff as well, then I'll be happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. I mean, so I've been inspired, and I'm thinking, gosh, because I like technology and I like all this sort of digital stuff. I'm thinking, I hadn't really thought about doing a sort of a qualification in it. So you've really opened my eyes to sort of that sort of thinking that actually outside the silos of what we're doing anyway, and it is part of our life now. It is not, we're not going to put that genie back in the bottle.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And if we don't understand enough about it, then somebody is going to sell us some snake oil, and that's not what we want to buy. We want to buy things that are really helpful and useful.
No, brilliant. Well, I want to say thank you ever so much. See if anything you want to disseminate to anybody, or you want to share, or you want information both ways, then let us know, because I think if the more we can collaborate on this sort of thing, then the better, because I think we're all working in our own fields, but there's definitely massive crossover, isn't there? Knowing sort of who we've got on the call today, and certainly the number of questions we've had. So thank you ever so much. It's been wonderful to sort of have that time, and thank you everybody for coming.
Opportunity. It's great to see you all.
Bye.